The bells of the convent tolled for the last time. High in the hills of Thessaly, where ancient olive groves twisted like ghosts in the sharp autumn wind, a small band of nuns gathered inside their fading chapel. This was no ordinary evening. It was the eve of an epic's end. They prayed beneath cracked frescoes, saints with faces long scraped away by age and sorrow, their silent gaze now focused on a fate they could not outrun. On the horizon, fire shimmered. Ottoman banners were already visible, not just as distant flags, but as a burning promise, red cloth fluttering like sparks across the mountains, a tide of conquest washing over the ancient world. The women knew exactly what that meant. It was the execution warrant delivered to their doorstep. No riders came from the nearby towns. The once trusted paths were empty. No soldiers remained to guard them, only the stillness of chilling, hollow quiet before the final conquest. Their abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, a woman whose spirit was as strong as the mountain granite, stood before the altar. She held a silver crucifix, tarnished but beautiful, that had survived a century of storms, fires, and whispered heresies. Looking at the cross, they were reminded of 1,000 years of unbroken faith. She whispered, her voice barely carrying over the rattling wind, "If they breach our walls, keep your vows inside your hearts that they cannot take." But she was wrong. When the empire's armies, countless and relentless, reached the convent gates, vows, prayers, and sanctity meant nothing against what history was determined to erase. The first stones of the convent collapsed before sundown. The dust and sparks rising from the walls formed the black ink of a new historical record. The hymns that once filled those halls were drowned out by the metallic clang of iron and the terrible sound of screams. The Ottomans didn't waste arrows on holy places. They shattered the gates with cannon fire, a thundering roar that was both a warning and a declaration. To them, a convent wasn't sacred ground. It was a defiant symbol, proof that the cross still dared to rise on conquered soil. Inside, the sisters hid their relics, the silver chalices, the embroidered icons, the sacred fragments of St. Bonzal beneath the chapel floor. They believed if their bodies were lost, their faith might still endure. These were not merely objects. They were the last vestiges of their collective soul. But the soldiers weren't after mere treasure. They wanted evidence. Proof that they had crushed not just the enemy's armies, but their very God. By nightfall, the surviving nuns were herded into the courtyard. Torchlight turned their white robes into shifting gold and shadow. They were told they'd be taken before the Pasha promise few ever lived to see fulfilled. What followed became a legend, so grim that even church chroniclers avoided the full details. By dawn, the convent was ash. Smoke drifted from the refectory where the women once shared bread in silence. Ottoman flags fluttered from the bell tower, signaling nearby units that resistance was over. Yet in that courtyard, something unexpected happened. The soldiers waiting for screams heard singing instead. Bound with rope, the surviving sisters began to chant a hymnod of despair, but of chilling defiance. The Agnus Dei, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Their voices trembled, but never broke. This was a strength far deeper than any sword. The Ottoman captain, unsure whether to laugh or silence them, ordered the abbess dragged forward. Eleni still clutched the silver cross rescued from the altar. The captain promised her mercy. If she renounced her God and accepted the conqueror's faith, her sisters would live. Her reply sealed her fate. "I have already given my life. What else can you take?" The captain hesitated, perhaps moved by her spirit, then turned away, leaving her to his men. It was a decision history would forever remember. What followed was never written in full. Even Ottoman records, which glorified victory, described it only as discipline for those who refused reason. Yet, in later European letters, her name resurfaced, Eleni of Lissa, the nun who would not kneel by midday. The convent's bells were melted for coin, and the rooftop cross was shipped east as a trophy. But soon, rumors spread across nearby villages. They said that, when the wind swept through the ruins at night, one could still hear women's voices, not crying, but praying. The rubble could not suppress their story. The smoke had barely faded when the march began. What remained of the Order 22 women in torn habits were driven south, toward the coast, ankles bound, watched by Ottoman horsemen. To the Empire, they weren't prisoners of war, but symbols of conquest, proof that even sacred walls could fall. The journey was a crucible of suffering. The road was unforgiving, baking under a merciless sun. The sisters, who had never stepped beyond their cloister walls, stumbled from thirst and exhaustion. The outside world was a strange and cruel domain to them. When one fell, another, even in chains, would lift her veils so soldiers wouldn't trample it. A final, small act of dignity in a world stripped of mercy. Their abbess was gone, but her last words endured among them. If you cannot hold the cross, hold each other. After 7 days of grueling walking, the captives reached the port of Volos. Waiting there were Ottoman galleys, ships designed not for comfort, but for absolute control. The women were herded aboard, wrists shackled to wooden benches where criminals and slaves once rode. As the sails caught the wind, the shores of Greece faded into the horizon, and with them everything they had ever known. The ship's overseer, Wisif Agar, kept meticulous records: cargo, spices, coins, textiles, and religious captives. It was this very ledger, discovered centuries later in the archives of Istanbul, that confirmed a story once dismissed as legend. The voyage to Constantinople lasted $12 brutal days. Storms lashed the deck. Salt stung their wounds. Hunger hollowed their faces. Yet what broke them most wasn't physical pain. It was the crushing silence. No one spoke to them except to bark commands. They existed like ghosts, floating between sky and sea. At night, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, whispered psalms beneath her breath. Her voice was faint, barely audible over the crashing waves. But even the chained prisoners around her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, turned their heads to listen. It was their silent acknowledgement that hope was still possible. For a moment, the turbulent sea seemed to still. When the ship finally entered the Bosphorus, the sisters saw the skyline of Constantinople rise before them, its domes and minarets glowing like sharp blades in the dawn. Across the strait, the city seemed alive, breathing with power. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now, it would become their cage. From the docks, they were paraded through narrow streets lined with merchants, soldiers, and slaves. Christian nuns among captives were a rarity, even in an empire built on conquest. They were led past the ancient walls of Blashany, toward the imperial district, where their fates would be sealed. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the once great cathedral of Christendom, they were forced to kneel. As the muezzin's calls echoed from the minarets, one of the sisters whispered, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Before dawn, they were taken into a marble courtyard surrounded by towering columns. This was not a dungeon. It was the Divan-i Humayun, the imperial council, where the will of the Sultan ruled above all. Here, captives were not judged by kings or priests, but by the empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their faith would be measured against the cold laws of conquest. At the center of the hall sat the Grand Vizier, a man whose expression betrayed nothing. To his left, scribes waited with ink and parchment, ready to record every detail: names, ages, and intended uses. Every word would be entered into registers that still survive centuries later. Stained by wax and time, the sisters stood in torn habits, eyes lowered. Through translators, they were told the Sultan had granted mercy on one condition. Those who accepted conversion would be given new names, food, and life within the palace. Those who refused would face the discipline of faith, a phrase that could mean imprisonment or simply disappearance. None spoke. Sister Magdalena trembled, recalling the fate of other captives brought before the vizier: Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all swallowed by the empire's silence. Before the guards could drag her forward, one of the elders, Sister Darose, stepped out of line. She addressed the vizier, not as a captive, but as someone who had lived long enough to watch empires rise and decay. "My lord," she said, "you may rename us, but you cannot rewrite the prayers we carry." The interpreter hesitated, unsure whether to translate such defiance. When he did, the vizier's face remained unreadable. Then he replied coldly, "Prayers fade when the tongue forgets how to speak them." With a motion of his hand, the sisters were dismissed, not to execution, but to the lower chambers of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified captives were kept. Some would call it mercy. Others would later call it something far worse. Some were given a different kind of prison, one disguised as service. Beneath the palace gardens lay a labyrinth of stone halls sealed from the sun. Each chamber had a thin slit for light, barely enough to tell night from day. The nuns were stripped of their habits, clothed in rough garments, and told they would now serve cleaning floors, sewing garments, feeding fires for the upper chambers. It was meant to break them, to turn holiness into servitude, but the Ottomans underestimated them. These were women who had already lived under vows of silence and denial. Hunger, cold, and solitude were nothing new. For them, suffering was not punishment. It was devotion made real. Even in this subterranean prison, their discipline became armor. At night, they prayed in secret. One carved a cross into the clay wall with her fingernail. Another traced verses into the dust beneath her straw bed. They began counting days by the rhythm of the muezzin's call, not out of conversion, but as a defiant clock for a faith that refused to die. Soon whispers spread among the palace servants. There were stories of the silent sisters, foreign women buried beneath the palace, who never spoke, never begged. Some called them cursed, others called them saints. Their silence echoed through the tunnels louder than any prayer. Days bled into months. Their hands blistered from labor, washing linens, polishing brass, tending fires that gave heat to others, but none to them. Their names were forbidden. Each woman was given a number, a mark of ownership. The empire believed time and hunger would bend even the strongest faith. That was when the next stage began, a test disguised as mercy. First came kindness. Food, oil, and silks were sent to their quarters. Learned men from the palace came to speak gently, offering rest, peace, even small freedoms. "Your God and ours are not enemies," one imam said. "Take our tongue and you will be free." But they all understood what that freedom meant, erasing the memory of who they were. To forget was the one sin they could not commit. Sister Magdalena, once frail and trembling, began to rise as their strength. She whispered, fragments of scripture remembered from their convent, verses half forgotten, reshaped into prayers that kept them alive. Even incomplete, the word endured. She was the thread holding their broken tapestry together. When persuasion failed, the masks came off. The torches were doused, food cut in half. No more kind visits, only silence and darkness. One by one, they were taken to a narrow room where scribes waited. Each was told to repeat a single phrase of submission. Those who did were allowed to live within the palace walls. Those who refused disappeared. It wasn't one grand act of cruelty, but a slow, methodical breaking of the soul. Faith wasn't torn away by force. It was chipped away by hunger, waiting, and the quiet voice asking, "Why suffer for a God who doesn't answer?" A few gave in. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, finally whispered the words. They were dressed in silk and taken away, never to be seen again. For those who remained, each disappearance hardened their resolve. Sister Darose, once brave before the Grand Vizier, grew thin and pale. When guards demanded her name, she smiled faintly. "Call me Silence," she said. Her defiance spread like a contagion. From that moment, none of them spoke to their captors again. When questioned, they answered only with stillness. And in that stillness, they reclaimed what the empire thought it had taken. Controlled official records mention them only in passing. Foreign captives, unresponsive, unproductive. To the Ottomans, they were failed conversions. To history, they became something else. Living proof that faith could survive where walls and chains could not. By the time spring returned to the palace gardens above, only 11 of the original 22 were still alive. The guards called them ghosts in rags. But the servants whispered of something stranger, that sometimes deep in the night, faint voices could be heard beneath the palace, chanting in a language no one remembered, but everyone feared. It was the same hymn they had sung as their convent burned, and within those forgotten corridors, where no sunlight reached, the survivors found something unexpected, an old sealed archway buried in dust and stone. At first, it was a hiding place, but slowly it became something sacred. They used broken pottery for candle holders, a scrap of linen for an altar cloth. From a shard of a shattered mirror, they fashioned a crude cross in this secret chapel. They gathered each night after the palace slept. No hymns, no sermons, only whispers. Each woman knelt and shared a memory. A home, a church bell, the warmth of bread before dawn. These memories became their new psalms. Small offerings to a God who still listened in the dark. A Venetian prisoner once wrote of strange voices echoing beneath the harem, women singing in Latin to a God not of this empire. For centuries, historians dismissed it as superstition until, beneath the Topkapi ruins, archaeologists uncovered a small chamber lined with Christian carvings, silent proof that their prayers had never truly stopped. Crosses scratched into the stone, a Latin phrase half erased by time. Lux in tenebris, the light shines in the darkness. That small discovery changed everything. It proved these women had not simply vanished. They had left a mark, a silent revolt etched into the walls. Inside the hidden chapel, Sister Magdalena, once frail, now the center of their faith, began marking the walls with charcoal. Names could not be written openly, so she devised symbols instead, a bird for each sister still alive, a small flame for those who had been lost. Whenever a new bird failed to appear, it meant another had disappeared. The guards never uncovered the chapel, yet they began to notice subtle shifts in their captives. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the confinement, the women moved with a quiet, almost unnatural calm. The overseers labeled it madness, but the scribes observing them recorded something else entirely. They had discovered a strength not of this world. By the time a new sultan rose to power, only a handful of the sisters remained, worn, aged, almost forgotten. Yet beneath the palace, their secret chapel hidden, eternal. Centuries later, when modern excavators explored Constantinople, no one expected that beneath layers of marble and empire, the fingerprints of these women would still be there. Women who had prayed in darkness, leaving behind the only thing the conquerors could never claim, their faith carved in stone. By $1,482, the palace had changed hands again. A new sultan, young and ambitious, ascended the throne with orders to purge any trace of weakness from his predecessors. Every servant, concubine, and laborer was meticulously recorded except one group. In the Topkapi archives, under columns of names, there was a blank space, a gap where 21 entries should have been. The ledger read, Muram unfit for service, disposed. No dates, no burial records, nothing. This was how history erased them, not with fire, but with withheld ink. The silence itself became proof. Only something shameful is hidden so carefully. Centuries later, an Ottoman courtier's diary surfaced in the archives of Bursa, cryptically mentioning foreign women who had refused to submit and disappeared beneath the palace foundations. Another letter intercepted by Venetian spies in $1,484 spoke of nuns who would not bow to the Sultan's will. Together, these fragments revealed a truth the empire had tried to bury: the deliberate erasure of women who had become spiritual symbols of resistance. The last record of Sister Magdalena comes from decades later, written by an Italian pilgrim. He recounted a story whispered by a palace servant, a woman who sang to her god until the guard sealed the room. Her name was unknown, but the faint hymn he described survived the stone itself. In that echo, her story endured. The chapel lies in ruins now, but the carvings remain. Faded prayers etched into the walls, a whisper of women who refuse to be forgotten. In their silence, they still speak, and if you've heard their story tonight, let it stay with you. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt when you saw what they endured. And if you want more untold stories buried in the shadows of history, subscribe and step deeper into the darkness with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they trail off.